Well, what we've learned, of course, is that pills, fix penises and they fix all kinds of things, but they don't fix people. And people still have anxieties and they still worry about their performance. And so it just seemed to me that this was an issue that really needed to be thought through. It needed to be discussed and it needed to be brought back to the forefront of discussions about sexuality.
You're listening to In Bed with Science, a sex podcast. I'm Lee Noren, a sex therapist with a Master of Science in Sexology and over 12 years of coaching, counseling, and therapy experience. Today, I'm sharing part one of a two-part series on sexual performance anxiety. In this interview, I'm talking to Dr. David Rowland about what performance anxiety actually is, how the brain can be really annoying sometimes and develop a preferred response toward anxiety, and why, and how, when we think we're doomed for failure, it makes us more likely to fail. But first, do you have a sex or relationship question you want to ask, but you're not quite sure where to turn? Now's your chance. I'm looking for thoughtful, personal questions about things like intimacy, mismatched libidos, emotional disconnect, and struggles with sexual pleasure and desire. Specifically, those messy, non-Hollywood experiences that we all have but rarely talk about. And I'll be answering them in upcoming episodes of the podcast with both compassion and scientific insight. Submit your story or question anonymously, or with your name if you'd like, and it might be featured in a future episode. Dr. David Rowland is a senior research professor at Valparaiso University in the US and a leading figure in sexual health and behavioral neuroscience. As you'll hear in our interview, he's been in the field since the late 60s, so that's pretty impressive. He's done fellowships at places like Stanford and Johns Hopkins. He's authored over 260 research papers, 5 books, has served as editor-in-chief of major journals, advised international societies, and trained professionals worldwide. Dr. David Rowland, welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure.
So, you've worked in this field of sex research, among other things, for many, many years, and I wanted to start by asking you how you got into this field, because I think that's always interesting.
It's a long story that I'll try to keep short, but I originally started my studies in the field of reproductive behavior and biology. The focus was on animal research. This was back in the 1960s and 70s. There was certainly a need to think about sexual behavior in humans and men and women. There was very little work that was being done at the time, but there was a movement within the groups that were studying reproductive biology and behavior to begin to look at issues surrounding human sexuality. And so eventually I made the transition from animal research to human research. So I actually come from a background of biopsychology, biological psychology. I'm not a clinician, but I study clinical problems, and I work a lot with clinicians, and I study clinical patients and things like that. Insofar as kind of my own personal journey, it has been very enlightening for me to learn so much about sexuality, and also a very rewarding experience for me to be able to share some of these ideas with other people, because I find that there are so many mythologies and so many pieces of misinformation regarding sexuality and sexual response. And even at this time, I continue to see the same errors and the same issues that are being mythologized or spread out there without any truth. And so I think it's very important that there be ongoing conversation about these sorts of issues. And I'm happy to be here and to be able to share some ideas with you and the audience.
Yeah, that kind of sounds a bit depressing, that it's the same mythologies that keep getting repeated throughout time.
But it's always the new generations that come with that learn through peer groups and pornography and you name it, social media. And so one of the problems is that there is really no good system of sexuality education in many parts of the world. It's sometimes totally absent, of course, and in other places it's restricted by certain kinds of issues about who can say what and what's the parent's role and so on. And I think one of the problems is that people simply don't learn these kinds of things in any formal way. So they pick up bits and pieces from peer and social media and often that's incorrect information.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't mean it to sound depressing, just that there's a lot of work to do, okay? There's always a lot of work to do in every field, and particularly this field, because it is an interesting field. And I really do think that the more that people learn about their sexuality, the more satisfying they will have in terms of a sexually healthy life and a rewarding life in that respect. So,
yeah, I completely agree with you. The paper that we're focusing on today is all about sexual performance anxiety. Could you please describe what you were aiming to do with that paper? Why that paper? Why that focus?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's not something that I would have written about 10 years ago. But the whole issue of sexual performance anxiety was a hot topic back in the 1980s. There were changes in the understanding of human sexuality in the 1990s and 2000s, such that it became possible to treat some sexual problems with medication. And this changed the whole scene, because it was thought that, well, no matter what the person's problem is, no matter what the etiology of that person's problem, there's a pill here that's going to help fix it. And so those individuals who for a long time had problems with sexual performance because of anxiety were now given an opportunity to overcome that problem by taking a drug. And it to some extent made the whole issue of anxiety and its role in sexual behavior, sexual responsivity, a past issue. It was no longer seen as relevant. Well, what we've learned, of course, is that pills, fix penises and they fix all kinds of things, but they don't fix people. And people still have anxieties and they still worry about their performance. And so it just seemed to me that this was an issue that really needed to be thought through. It needed to be discussed, and it needed to be brought back to the forefront of discussions about sexuality. And I'm not saying that this paper has achieved that, but I hope that it's one step and that other people will begin to think about the role of sexual anxiety, and specifically sexual performance anxiety, insofar as people's behavior with their partners and so on.
I thought that was beautiful how you put it. Pills fix penises, but not people.
Yeah, it's absolutely the case. They fix the physiology, but they don't fix the whole person. So, and this is something that we've learned from generations of giving people pills, that often the pills are discarded at some point, because while they might temporarily fix the problem, they really don't help the person in the kinds of areas where the person really needs help. And that may be in communication with the partner, it may be relationship aspects, it may be building self-confidence, all of these other kinds of issues that play into a good, healthy sexual relationship.
Just thinking about, some of my clients, what I see as well is even sometimes when you fix anxiety in one domain, it will kind of hop over to another domain as well. So maybe erectile issues aren't a thing anymore, but there might be something else that then becomes the thing they develop anxiety surrounding anyway.
Absolutely. So people have, and we can talk about this later as we go through some of the other issues, but there are dispositions and there are situations. And I always like to keep both of those aspects in mind. In other words, what is that person's situation at this time, and how is that contributing to a problem? What is that person's disposition? And that disposition referring to the characteristics that person brings to that particular situation. And of course, we all bring different things based upon our experiences, our genetics, our, you name it, our rearing, et cetera, our peer groups. We bring different things, and those become our dispositions, and they interact with the situations. And so therefore, you change the situation, the disposition may not change. You change the disposition, the situation may still be a very powerful set of stimuli that are having this effect on the person and creating the anxiety or moving the anxiety from one place to another place.
So we're talking about the anxiety they feel. How would you describe what sexual performance anxiety is and kind of when it arises and why?
Yeah, I think the way to start this is to talk about the three basic aspects of sexual performance anxiety. Okay, so I first want to make the distinction between sexual anxiety, of which there are a number of different kinds of sexual anxiety. And in fact, there will be a paper coming out on this fairly soon, on which I'm a co-author. So, for example, looking at such things as distress related to a sexual problem may be different or is different than sexual performance anxiety, or the anxiety that arouses from pleasing a partner and the attachment issues surrounding that and so on. So there are different kinds of sexual anxiety, sexual performance anxiety being one of those, and one that most people feel at some point in their life, okay? This is not a rare event. This is something that, because of the nature of sexuality, people feel this need to perform in some adequate way. So this takes us to kind of what I think of as the three elements. One is expectation. There are expectations on you to do something, whether those expectations derive from yourself or they derive from some social standard out there that men will always do this, women will always be doing this in the bedroom, and so on. So there's the expectation. There is then the evaluation, this sense that if I do not live up to this expectation, my evaluation will be a negative evaluation. So we begin with expectation, the fact that a person has to perform at a certain level, and anything under that will be a disappointment to the person himself or herself, and will likely be viewed as therefore a disappointment to the partner, and so on. Somebody's out there evaluating this, okay? And you can think of this, by the way, not only in terms of sexual performance anxiety, but any kind of performance anxiety. You're talking about a perceived expectation, and you're talking about an evaluation based upon meeting that expectation. Think about sports and athletics. Think about public speaking. Okay, so performance anxiety enters our lives in many different situations, including sexual situations. The third element, then, is the consequence. So if the person feels that the evaluation is a bad one, and sometimes it may be a bad one, there's the sense that there could be ill consequences for that individual. That is, my partner won't feel satisfied. My partner will see me as inadequate. There are all kinds of embarrassment, shame things that go along with it. And this, of course, is the same thing in areas like athletics and public speaking, although it's a much more public venue there, okay? And therefore the consequences may actually be consequences about money and fame and whatever. Fortunately, in the bedroom, it's limited to psychological consequences. Not that they're any less important. They're extremely important, and they're extremely enduring. But in fact, not the public display that you see in other situations. I don't know if you're a film buff. There was a famous movie called Satyricon many years ago, and I forget the director. One of the scenes was a person who was taken to the Forum in Rome and required to perform in front of the huge Colosseum audience. The person couldn't get an erection, and this was a horrible thing. So, Fellini was the director, okay. So classic.
Thank God we don't have to do that.
Yes, exactly right. So ours is a much more private kind of response, with private consequences, personal consequences, yes.
Right. So it's those kind of three different types, you were saying, of sexual performance anxiety.
I'm sorry, there are three different aspects of it.
Three different aspects, yes.
Evaluation, and the consequence, okay? And there are ways to mitigate all of these kinds of things. And when you begin to look at therapeutic strategies, it may move towards expectation. Don't set yourself up for failure because you have an expectation that's unrealistic. It could be the evaluation component, okay, the whole idea of couples therapy. It's no longer this person who's being evaluated, it's the couple who's looking at this situation and looking for a solution, okay? Or the consequences. The consequences may be overstated or overthought or whatever, and the consequences may be very insignificant in the long run, because of course we're human and failure is a part of being human. So there are always so this is one way of thinking about this. I'm not saying this is the best way to think about interventions or therapies, but just starting with situation and dispositions and things like that, and these kinds of three elements to sexual performance anxiety can get any therapist thinking about how you begin to then go about helping a person who's suffering from anxiety related to sexuality.
So we're talking about all of this anxiety, and it sounds awful, and as we all know, because everyone's experienced anxiety at some point in their lives, it is awful. But you mention in the paper, and this is what I talk about with clients a lot, which is that all of our emotions have functions, and it's important to feel them. What would you say is the function of anxiety?
Good point, because anxiety, we typically think of anxiety as being the response to a perceived threat, not an actual threat. Fear is the response to an actual threat, okay? to an actual stimulus, okay, that is going to be injurious or whatever. Anxiety is the response to the perception that there is a threat in the air, that there's something here that is going to destroy us, okay? Whether it's physical or psychological, that's what the issue is. But as with any negative emotion, as you point out, these are very important emotions for us to have. If we don't have these negative emotions, if we don't feel anger, fear, we would not be here today. We would not be here as a species. And by the way, most other species have these rudimentary emotions. They too would not have survived. So they play a very, very important role in terms of the survival of the individual, because they warn us of danger. They tell us that there's a threat to us, and therefore we need to respond in some particular way that takes us out of that situation. I like to talk to people about how we think about emotions, because this is very important. An emotional state. Think, for example, when you feel anger or fear or whatever, what does it do? The first thing that it does is it reorders your priorities, right? You focus on that problem. You are doing something else, but you hear something that is alarming and you immediately turn your focus to that problem. So it helps you reorder things very quickly. Critically important, effective emotion. The second thing that it does is it channels or it energizes you, it activates a response. And again, think of any situation where you've been emotionally upset. You want to respond, you want to do something about it, and sometimes we do things that are not helpful. We respond rashly and so on, okay? But that's the whole point of an emotion, is to warn, is to make certain that the person is energized to respond in that particular situation, so as to deal with that particular threat that might be there. So that negative emotion is serving a very, very important process. I can also talk, and maybe this is not the time to talk about this, but how these negative emotions and how anxiety can then interfere with sexual response. Is that something that we should talk about at this point? Is this okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, something that's very important to realize is that anything that we feel, such as a negative emotion, has some kind of representation or corresponding set of events in the brain. And for any negative emotion, and anxiety would fall into this category, there is going to be a response in the brain that is going to alert a lot of other parts of the brain. And we talk about the amygdala, for example, in the paper. The amygdala we think of as kind of a center for learning emotion or emotional learning. This is the center of the brain that is essentially responding to the information that there may be a threat in the environment. You have to think of it, it's coming in through the sensory processes, the cognitive systems, it's being interpreted, and it's interpreted as a threatening situation. It may be an actual or a perceived threatening situation. This activates the amygdala, and it is the amygdala then that, how can I say, orchestrates the response of the organism to this perceived threat. And that may involve triggering other parts of the brain, the hypothalamus, endocrine response, hormonal response, and so on. It may involve the actual feeling of emotion, increased bodily changes, okay, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The bodily heart rate increasing, sweating, things like that, okay? And the amygdala also then communicates with the frontal lobe. It's the part of the brain that tries to activate the organism to do something. So, for example, I'd mentioned before, any emotion, negative emotion, is going to energize the organism to do something. And the amygdala is that part of the brain that basically suggests that this is what we should do. In the really raw or rudimentary system, what I call the Paleolithic brain or the alligator brain, that brain underlying down there, that response is going to be fight or flight. But as humans, we learn to moderate that response, okay? Our frontal lobe sometimes says, no, it's not appropriate to get into a tussle with this individual. It's not appropriate to run away. You're going to look like a fool if you run away at this time. So it is the frontal lobe that begins to moderate our responses and help us deal and manage these strong urges of fight or flight that are coming from the amygdala. And the amygdala eventually learns, kind of in connection with the frontal lobe, this is the best procedure that seems to work in the past, and this is what we will do. But I will tell you, the impact of the amygdala is extremely strong. And even when we get those emails that are very, very upsetting to us, we want to sit down and pound something out and say, well, you idiot, you should know this, et cetera, right? The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that says, okay, don't push the send button today. Let's wait until tomorrow, okay? But part of all of this is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is that part of the brain that responds that prepares the organism for the fight or the flight. What it does, think of it in these terms. If you're going to be up against some physical foe, some kind of physical task, you have to have strength, okay? And you have to have the strength where you need it. People talk about the miracle of being under pressure and doing this. Well, what happens basically is that the amygdala is communicating with other parts of the brain to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system essentially sends all of the blood to those parts of the body that have to respond well. And that includes such things as the heart and the lungs, as you might expect internally, but it also sends blood to the large muscle masses in the body where you're going to need extraordinary strength, right? And how do you get extraordinary? By feeding as much oxygen as you can to those muscles, to the body, to the large body muscles that might be involved in either flight or fight, okay? But as you send blood, you have a limited amount of blood in your system. So as you shunt it to one place, it's got to come from another place. So what the body does basically is sets a priority. We're sending blood to the brain. We're sending blood to the torso, to the trunk, to the legs. We have to take blood from other places, and we're going to take it from where we don't need it. We take it from the hands, from the fingers. We take it from the nose, from the periphery. We have a cold nose. We have the cold hands, and so on, okay? But we also take it from the gastrointestinal. We don't need to be digesting food at this moment, and we take it away from the genitals, okay? So basically, the blood flow to the genitals becomes restricted. Well, this means that under any kind of anxiety, which triggers sympathetic nervous system activity, there's going to be decreased activation in the region of the genitals. And so by definition, under stress and anxiety, people's sexual responses are going to be dampened because the blood that is needed to engorge these organs is simply being used elsewhere, okay? And even if the person isn't under duress, physical duress, that blood is surely not going to the genitals, okay? It's going elsewhere in the body, but it's not going there. So there's a real corresponding physiological response to anxiety that explains why it may be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for a man to get an erection or for a woman to feel lubrication under those conditions, because the system is simply not worried about those things at that moment because that's not the priority. And this goes for other kinds of sexual problems as well. In other words, think of it this way. And this is not so much of blood shunting, but think of it this way. The last thing that a person needs is to feel really sexually desiring at a time of stress, okay? That comes later, okay, in the moments of safety and security and courtship and so on. But so under long-term stress, you can begin to see how these kinds of systems will actually, in a sense, turn down the level of sexual responsivity, of sexual desire, and so on. So I don't know if that gives you the sense of, I could go on, but I think you probably have other agenda items here. So.
No, this is really interesting. I think it's so important that you talk about it from that perspective as well, because I think especially on social media, a lot of people get the impression that anxiety is almost like a mindset thing and it's only psychological. And they miss the fact that actually you can't kind of steer your bodily functions in the way that we've been led to believe. So I think it's really important. What it made me think about is, what about for people who kind of use sex or masturbation as a way of kind of almost regulating their anxiety? Would you say it's almost like they haven't reached a peak anxiety threshold, therefore they still have sexual function, or how could we understand that?
Well, here's one thing to think about, and that is that, again, there are different kinds of anxieties, okay? And if the anxiety is somehow impinging upon the person's sexual life, then it is likely to affect the person's sexual response. But that's not always the case. The anxiety may come from a totally different set of situational factors. And in that situation, there's no performance anxiety, is there? Because it's not about expectation, evaluation, and consequence, okay? It's about something else. So there may be an anxiety there, and if that anxiety level is high enough, it is likely to actually interfere with masturbation. But if it's an ongoing anxiety, people can often get erections under those conditions, so it's not a problem, and in fact, it does reduce the anxiety. But I will also say this, and that is that the same things that become kind of perpetuating, self-perpetuating cycles within a sexual relationship. You know, you fail once and so you fail again, and it gets worse and worse, and you come to expect failure, can happen during masturbation if the masturbation is being used as kind of a practice or a test session for partnered sex. So there are these situations where the person begins to think in the same way rather than attending to the erotic stimulation of the moment. The person is beginning to attend to what's my body doing. And the more the person attends to what's my body doing, the less that person attends to the erotic stimuli. And so even during masturbation, you can find that some men and women are, because they're monitoring their responses rather than erotically allowing themselves, they actually have difficulty getting an erection or have difficulty reaching an orgasm and so on. So you can see it transfer to masturbation, but you're right, in many situations, masturbation can become an antidote to anxiety. It's kind of like, here are the negatives, let's try to increase the positives over here. And, you know, whenever you have two things and one is here and the other is here, okay, the differential becomes huge. But if you can do this, then this doesn't stand out so much. This is true with pain systems and so on, okay? If you have just pain in your body, well, it's a horrible thing. But if you can balance that pain with other kinds of stimulation from other resources and so on, that pain starts becoming mitigated. So
you were talking about before that the amygdala kind of almost develops like a standardized way of interpreting the situation. And we were touching on before that you know, it's a situation that can produce anxiety, but some people might be more disposed to developing anxiety. Kind of, you were talking in the paper about, did you call it state trait anxiety?
Yes.
I'm assuming that there are kind of biological and psychological and social reasons. What are they?
Well, as a person who thinks about these things, I'm sure you're aware of that these labels sometimes don't really provide much explanation. So, for example, we know that people who are high in negative affectivity or neuroticism tend to have more problems with sexual issues, but it's not really the neuroticism. That doesn't explain anything. That's our label that we put on a set of symptoms, okay? So what you need to, but these might well be dispositional, okay? They're things that the person kind of carries around with them. You do better if you step outside of these labels and begin to think of what this means. And usually there are certain kinds of characteristics that might play in here that would be helpful to think about. And one might be, such individuals tend to be much lower on self-efficacy, the kind of the idea that they have control over their destiny. They know where they're going and they know how to get there, whether that destiny is getting something done today or you know, their life's work or just getting an erection. They have a sense of self-efficacy about what they're doing. And we know that, and again, as a person who probably understands cognitive behavioral things, we know that people think about what they're going to be doing and they visualize themselves doing this, that, or the other. And people with high self-efficacy see themselves in situations where they're typically successful. People who have low self-efficacy worry about that failure all the time. And this is, of course, what happens. This is the vicious cycle that I mentioned before. The cycle becomes stronger, the person worries more, the anxiety becomes greater, and so on. And overall, that person is doomed for failure because that person sees himself failing, and there's no other image that person sees other than that image. So I just use self-efficacy perhaps as one of these things, but it might include other factors such as people being extra sensitive to what their partner says, high sensitivity issues. For example, my partner said, well, that was pretty good. Oh, only pretty good. As opposed to, wow, I'm glad you really enjoyed it. It was pretty good for me too, you know? So something like, okay, I mean, they're very different responses, right? And people who are very sensitive to social criticism are likely to take things in different ways than other people. People who tend to internalize a lot about what they are and are not able to achieve. I mean, a great way for any man or woman to think about their sexual problem is to think of it as coming from outside themselves. Put the blame on something else rather than put the blame on you, internal attribution. Once you put the blame on you, then you have to somehow fix yourself, okay? If you put the blame on something else, you can at least say, well, look, this just wasn't the right situation. I was under stress, whatever. You start coming up with rationales or whatever. People who tend to be self-critical, who tend to internalize attributions more, are much more likely to suffer. So these are the dispositions that I'm talking about. And while we can give them labels, I think there are very clear pieces here that can actually be worked upon in any kind of therapeutic situation. And this is why it's important not to talk about labels, because you can't change, you can't fix the person's label. Or maybe you can, I don't know, we can, whatever. But what you can do is you can help the person develop confidence, okay? You can help the person develop real expectations. You can help the person understand that placing all the blame on yourself is not a productive way of dealing with or coping with a problem. It simply can exacerbate the problem because you feel more and more responsible. And one study that I love that we did was simply looking at men who came to a urology clinic, and we asked them, and they had erectile dysfunction, what do you think your erectile function is the result of? And there were those men who could pretty easily say, well, I have diabetes. And there were men who said, oh, I have cardiovascular. And there were men who said, I don't know, I can't figure it out. It was those men who would self-attribute. They couldn't point to anything outside of themselves that they could hold responsible. Their levels of anxiety were much higher than the men who could clearly point to something that was this external factor and so on. So I look at not the label so much, but the actual processes, because the processes are changeable, okay? We can always help people become more confident. We can give them the support, the networks, and the communication skills with their partner and things like that, so.
Yeah. I think it was interesting how you brought up that example of kind of the men who blame themselves and kind of reaching a conclusion, well, that's not, a healthy coping mechanism and it's not going to help them. And also the kind of analogy with sexual performance anxiety and comparing it to kind of sports performance anxiety or just general performance anxiety. Because I was thinking about talking about films, watching sports films where the coach is really, really hard on the people playing baseball or football or whatever it might be. And there being this idea in society of you need someone being hard and tough and not necessarily complimentary for you to succeed, for you to perform. Yet here we're talking about how dysfunctional it is.
So the question then is, or the comment that you're making is that in some respects that becomes a bad coping mechanism or a bad situation. In other words, if you hold a standard that's unachievable, then yes, that's the worst thing possible. I think in athletics, this often happens. Little league, with parents. What happens? The child just comes to avoid the situation, right? This is what happens in sex. If you feel as though you can't meet the expectation, some people just give up and they avoid sex and so on. Can create a very negative framework for the individual. On the other hand, if it's done in the correct way, with all the support to get you there, that's a totally different thing. And within a relationship, that means couples working together, right? It means having some tools that the therapist can say, work on this, think about this, use a little bit of relaxation here, start reframing the situation. So these are the tools that the therapist can offer to the couple to help them get to a certain point. I'm sure you're very on board with this. The whole idea is not to get a better erection or a higher peaked orgasm or something. The goal is to have good intimacy with a good sexual experience or a good emotional experience, and to enjoy those things that are a part of sex, but not always necessarily the erection part or the orgasm part and things like that. So it's kind of, again, taking this holistic approach and saying that this is one way where we can help individuals move towards a goal that they want without necessarily saying, well, you need to get an erection. What we're doing is we're simply saying, well, let's work on getting you to this point, and this comes through the various tools that you have available. So,
yeah. With avoidance specifically, and we're talking about how that's sort of a dysfunctional coping mechanism, say in your paper that it is something that can kind of almost maintain the issue, even though obviously in the short term it feels like you're kind of getting rid of it because you don't need to sort of notice the anxiety, or you don't put yourself in situations where you notice it. How does that work from a psychological perspective? Why does it maintain it for us?
Well, you know, a lot of our understanding of this comes from animal research, okay, from the rat research of the 1960s and 70s, where a rat would experience a shock in some kind of a chamber and would learn very well to avoid that part of the chamber forever, okay, forever, would never go there, would never test again whether that shock was there, even though the shock may have been given once, one failure, okay, the rat would never go back there. So there is the replacement of an actual stimulus that can be injurious, a shock, with the fear surrounding that particular environment. There's never a test of whether that stimulus is there. And a lot of people who have sexual performance anxiety actually get over it on their own, okay? So this isn't something that is the worst possible thing in the world. People have their own little strategies for doing this, and it may be in conjunction with their partner. It may be trying this, that, or the other thing. It may be taking the emphasis off an erection or an orgasm or whatever, okay? And these are the kinds of things then that play out well. But the thing that doesn't play out well is never testing the situation again to see if the shock is there or to see if the actual stimulus is there. Sometimes it's important to go back to a situation and say, okay, I'm feeling a little more confident today. I'm feeling better physically. I'm psychologically up for this, and I'm just interested in your body as my partner or whatever. And I'm going to focus on that, and I'm not going to worry about this other stuff. Whether or not everything's perfect physically, sexually, we're going to enjoy this experience, okay? So, I mean, again, it's the tools of reframing, the tools of thinking about expectation, the tools of helping the individual move towards it, and thinking about how anxiety can, while it can interfere with those kinds of things, can always be addressed in some way with anybody. I mean, not always quickly, but with time and with experience. So, you know, when we talk about athletics and stage performance, the best way to prevent anxiety is to be over-prepared, okay? Super prepared, to have everything down to a reflexive process. And this is what actors and athletes do. Everything becomes reflexive. If they have to think about what they're doing, you can bet that they will fail at what they're doing. They don't have to think about what they're doing because it becomes so ingrained in them. Now, sometimes there's a disruption of that process for whatever reason. Somebody says something, there's noise out here from the audience, then the person has to go into a different mode of cognitive processing and the reflexive stimulus response is disrupted. Well, this is one thing that we often try to get men and women to do, is to focus back on the erotic cues rather than on themselves, rather than talking to themselves. That's the last thing you want people doing during sex, is talking to themselves. They should be talking to their partners, okay? They shouldn't be talking to, am I getting an erection, and am I getting, they shouldn't be doing those kinds of things, okay? They should be paying attention to the moment. Hence the whole mindfulness approach towards sexual problems, right? I mean, it's attention to the moment and enjoyment of the moment and letting everything else go. So a lot of therapies are actually based upon the idea of managing anxiety in one way or another by keeping the focus on these particular erotic cues and not on all the other conversations that you could be having about what you're doing and not doing and so on.
Moving on, in the paper, you talk about how sexual performance anxiety is a common part of different kind of sexual dysfunctions. Why do you think it's not its own diagnosis?
Yeah, I go back briefly to the history that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation here. And I think the whole idea that anxiety was a problem became somewhat dismissed as there were solutions that could help people with anxiety still perform. I think, as I've also said, but we've learned that anxiety is still prevalent and it's still a part of most people's sexual experience at one time or another. And so I think there is now a return to wanting to understand better how anxiety plays a role For a long time, we made the distinction between somatogenic erectile problems and psychogenic. Once Viagra came along, just went out the window. We didn't care anymore. You give anybody a pill, it's going to help them. That's not true, by the way. People who are highly anxious, the pills don't work. They may not work. They may help, but they may not work as you might hope for. Well, I think the reality is that we've now come to the point where we see that anxiety is a very important part of any sexual problem. By the way, even sexual problems that are somatogenic, okay, there's always a certain amount of anxiety. Is it going to work this time? Is it not? Should I bother? All of those kinds of things go on. I think there is some movement back towards looking at conditions that might be more psychological than clear somatogenic conditions, such as diabetes and metabolic disorder and so on. And I can give you one example. I'm part of a consultation for the International Committee on Sexual Medicine. We have been looking at the current diagnostic nosologies, how do you assess this, how do you assess that? And there's actually now been discussion again, and I don't want to say things prematurely here because this may or may not happen, but there are discussions about a classification of psychosocial erectile dysfunction. Conversations, okay? Difficult to define. What does this mean? I mean, the first thing I would put into that box is anxiety, okay?
Yeah.
And I think many people would, and our own experience has been that when you ask men and women about why they're having a sexual problem, whether or not it's true or whether or not it's the only etiological factor, anxiety almost always comes up as one of the reasons why they think they can't achieve the sexual response or perform adequately. And maybe it's just a convenient scapegoat, I don't know. But when you list anxiety among 10 or 15 other things, and you give people a choice to choose as many as you want, or you say choose the one that's most important, anxiety always comes out as playing an important role. And so this is the way that people feel. So I think you're right that we really need to study this more. And for a long time, I don't think there was good study of this because the whole idea was put on the back burner for so long. And now it's time for this to happen again. And there could well be. I would actually like to see more conversation about the idea that maybe there should be some kind of category that focuses more on etiological factors related to psychosocial, maybe even cultural factors, expectations that come from cultural factors. Men have to do this, women have to do this, or men shouldn't do this, or women should never do that, and so on. So maybe we're moving in that direction, and I don't have a clear response other than it's a lot easier to say, oh, there's a problem of blood flow into this person's genitals than it is to try to define what we mean by those psychosocial disorders. So it's a real challenge.
Yeah, well, I look forward to following and seeing what happens.
Me too.
Yeah. If you were to name 2 key takeaways from your paper, what would they be?
One, we need more research on this area. That is one reason why we developed this model, so that people could see how these things come together. What's the role of the stimuli? What's the role of appraisal? What's the role of functional coping response? What's the role of failed motor? All of these are points of research that really need to be investigated, and along with that are points of application. So if you think of the different therapies that we have, a lot of those therapies enter at different points. Reframing enters at the point of appraisal, okay? Desensitization and relaxation at the point of actually mitigating the anxiety response. So it couples removing the evaluation. So there are both research reasons and application reasons to think in terms of models like this. That's the one thing. I think the other thing that I want people to take away from this is that we can understand more about sexual anxiety if we pay attention to it. And we can help people through their problems if we pay attention to this very overwhelming sort of process. And we develop tools and understand how those tools actually fit into the patient's or the client's framework of how they see themselves and how they're responding. And we then say, well, there are tools available to you, okay? And these tools can work, and they do work. And I'm very much a fan of saying, let's combine the psychological. If we have a pill that they can take to help them move along and build confidence, let's take advantage of it. Okay, I don't think we're going to solve all the problems with anxiety by talk therapy, but we're going to certainly do a lot of the preliminary work that needs to be done and help the clients understand what's going on. I think the more that they understand about themselves here, about their own sexuality, but also how anxiety can be disruptive and how it can come from many sources, I think they will help find their own solutions much more readily than if they're kind of clueless about where is this coming from. Yeah. So I think those are, I hope, the kinds of things that come out of this model building. And one of the limitations is that the model itself has been tested kind of in some therapeutic environments, but it really needs to be tested and researched and whatever. And when I wrote that paper, I kept thinking, boy, if I were only supervising doctoral dissertations, I could say, do this. I could come up with 15 different theses or dissertations just from that single paper. I don't know. People have an interest, it's probably not an area that's going to get well funded. It's one of these soft areas. It's not, basic epidemiological medicine or anything. And I hope this starts the conversation.
I hope you're right, and I hope this podcast can kind of help serve starting the conversation too, or contributing to it. How can people keep up to date with your work if they want to?
I think you can Google Scholar. I actually am not very good at promoting some of my work. So
you should be.
I should, yes. I'm happy that I can do research and that I have an opportunity to address these kinds of questions. I mean, I'm really in a privileged position here to be able to think about these sorts of things. And certainly people can Google me and they can do Google Scholar and find out what I'm doing. I think those are probably the best ways. I'm not very good with social media, so that's unfortunate. But maybe, as you say, if people listen to the podcast and they start getting ideas, they can read a paper or two. I've written 3 or 4 papers now on this. The SPA model that we've been talking about is kind of the third paper where we've looked at performance anxiety in these different settings of athletics and sport, stage and the bedroom. And we've also talked about kind of theoretical models that unify what's going on. And then this paper was the most recent paper. But not all of my research has to do with anxiety. A lot of it gives tribute to the role of anxiety, but not so much of it is focused on anxiety. So I hope that there are new generations coming through that begin to see the value of doing this. And I will always do another podcast with you, Lee, so I'd be happy to do that. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, it's been my pleasure, and it's not often that somebody lets me just go on and on, so I really I really appreciate the opportunity. So I hope it's been a learning experience and fruitful, and I hope that that's the way that your audience perceives it. So it's yes. Delightful stuff. The more you learn about yourself and about how you can control yourself and your environment, I think the more satisfied people are with their lives.
Yeah, wise words to end with. Thank you. One of the things I found so interesting in this conversation with David was what he said at the end, which is we may be on the verge of a new classification for erectile difficulties called psychosocial erectile dysfunction. But because this falls into what the research world considers a quote-unquote soft area, it's unlikely to get the funding that it deserves. And honestly, this kind of thing, probably no surprise to anyone, really drives me up the wall, because anyone who's ever struggled with an erection or an orgasm or lubrication or desire, they know that these soft problems can still be devastating, even if they fall within that area of soft. They impact our mental health and our confidence and our relationships and our physical well-being. And we also know on the flip side how good sex, so sex that feels wanted and enjoyable, can have huge positive effects. And there was even a study a while back showing that people were, I think it was that they were more productive at work the day or days after having good sex. And if anything should appeal to a capitalist society, it would be that, right? But in all seriousness, we know that pleasure matters. We know sexual difficulties can take a real toll. So for this area to be underfunded is, in my opinion, just ridiculous. And especially now when the world is so volatile and life feels heavy for so many of us, if anything, what most of us could use more of is joy and pleasure. The things that, if you think about it, really make life worth living. David and I also talked about that mind-body connection and how sort of historically we've treated the mind and the body as two separate systems. So you have your psyche over here and you have your body over there. But what this research really shows is that, especially when it comes to sexual performance anxiety, and in my personal view, everything is intertwined. And that matters. And I think especially for a lot of men, because the cultural ideals around male sexual performance they're pretty brutal. You're supposed to get hard instantly, stay hard for the entire duration of sex. You're meant to last ages, control your orgasm perfectly, and then ejaculate like a porn star. And when any of those things don't happen, which for the most part they don't really, it shakes people to their core. And it's not only the person experiencing the anxiety, and especially in hetero relationships, I often see the female partner, if the male partner has the performance anxiety, respond as if a softened erection is proof that they're physically unattractive. They take it personally, which makes sense, right? Because I think we've all been led to believe that men want sex all the time, and the reason they want sex is because of how you look, when we know that attraction is so much more complex than that. Attraction is also about emotional connection and presence and trust and liking someone, or how they smell, or how they make you feel about yourself. And then when it comes to performance anxiety, it's not like the attraction is the main thing, right? It's about the stress they feel, the physiological stress going on in their body, which actively prevents erection. So when performance anxiety is in the room, it's like everything gets filtered through that lens, I think, for both partners. Which brings me to what David gave as an example about that lens of performance anxiety. So he said, you know, if someone says, well, that was pretty good, someone without performance anxiety hears, yeah, that was nice. But someone with performance anxiety hears, it was fine, not great, you didn't do a good job, and I'm disappointed. So it really distorts how we interpret our partner, our conversations, and our connection, which is also why talking about sex can be so difficult, becomes like a minefield for both partners. Because even these neutral comments or positive comments feel loaded, and it becomes difficult then for both partners. And so the partner struggling with performance anxiety feel like they're a failure, perhaps like they're not manly enough, and like there's something really wrong with them. And their partner feels like they're physically unattractive and like their partner's lost all their attraction to them. And that lowers their self-confidence and makes the connection piece even harder. So the question becomes, what do we do about it? Well, you've got two options here. So option one is, in 2 weeks, I'm releasing part 2 of this series on performance anxiety, which is a more practical sort of step-by-step conversation with a researcher and clinician about what actually helps. So you can think about today as the theory part and the next time is the how. Option 2 is, if you don't want to wait, this is literally the speciality of my one-to-one online program, Redesire, where I work with people every day who experience different kinds of sexual anxiety, one of them being performance anxiety. And it's for people who want a clear and supported way forward, and you can find that link in the show notes if you're interested. But whatever you choose, even if you're not ready to do anything yet, I want you to know this. You're not alone, and it can get so much better. And on the other side of this work is sex that actually feels good again. Sex that feels present and pleasurable and hot. And it's that kind of sex that makes you remember why you even wanted it in the first place. And you deserve that. That's it for In Bed with Science. Please remember that everything shared in this episode is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice or therapy. For personal support, please reach out to a qualified professional. Thanks for listening.